Hey everyone, it's John here, and we're here with Mark McClusky, the author of this amazing new book, Faster, Higher, and Stronger. How sports science is creating a new generation of super athletes and what we can learn from them. Mark, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, this is awesome. I'm glad we were able to hook up, and I just did best books of the year, and right when I finished that article, your book came out, and so so I'm like, oh, I better do one more because this book is really, really good and really interesting, I think, for our audience here. So maybe you could just share a little bit of your story, how you got interested in this topic.
Sure. I mean, like a lot of people who end up writing about sports, I'm a failed athlete myself. I was a decent cyclist as a kid. I mean, good, but not great. And then there came a point where, I stopped winning races, and I wondered what was going on. You know, I wasn't riding as much as I maybe could have, certainly, but life took me in a different direction. I, became a sports writer. So I worked at Sports Illustrated for 5 years or so. Got to cover my first Olympics in 1996 there, and have now been at Wired for about 9 years, and have covered a couple more Olympics here, sort of from the science and technology angle. So it's really, the book kind of brings together the two sides of my personality. I joke about trying to bridge the geek-jock divide.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think, when I was reading your book, some of the things that kept hitting me was that a lot of the scientists that you interviewed, a lot of the people who are really on the technological side of sports these days, whether it's in performance training or research or genetics, a lot of them came from that same sort of background.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who end up in sort of the non-athlete side of sports, have that background, and I think I write about Claude Bouchard in the book, who's a geneticist who had a similar experience. He was a really good junior hockey player, and then stopped getting bigger, and everybody else got bigger, and he was kind of like, well, why?
Yeah.
And, those questions really nagged at him over the course of his career. And I think, it was kind of the same with me. David Epstein writes about a similar thing in his book, The Sports Gene, that, he just wanted to understand why some people responded so differently to training than he did. And, I think if you're curious, and I think if you have those questions, those are things that kind of stick in the back of your mind and stay with you.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that a lot of these people that you were working with, they all kind of had a similar story where there's this feel-good factor about, hey, if I just put in the hours and I just work really hard, I could be as good as them. And then you come across one of them and you're like, oh my God, no, I can't.
Yeah, it's Andy Jones is a researcher in the UK. He's one of the really prominent researchers around beet juice, and he was also Paula Radcliffe's physiologist. Mm-hmm. And when he first met Paula, and sort of got her on a treadmill and did some, VO2 max testing with her, and was, Andy was a UK record holder in, I believe it was the 2-mile run. Mm-hmm. And in talking to him about it, he's like, oh, well, she kind of killed my athletic career because I saw what that really exceptional physiology looked like, and it was just so far beyond what he had. I mean, it's just, she's, justifiably holds one of the greatest world records around. I mean, her physiology is insane.
Yeah, and I think the the thing, it sort of, it hurts us, like, oh, I guess that can't be me. But I think that what we sometimes lose is that just because you can't be Paula Radcliffe doesn't mean sports can't have an incredible role in your life.
Well, exactly. I think that, like, there's that aspirational nature of, we all dream about. For me, it was winning the Tour, or hitting the bucket at the end of Game 7 in the NBA Finals, or hitting the home run in Game 7, or, scoring the touchdown in the Super Bowl. And those dreams motivate us. Those dreams are important. I think that it's also important to realize, like, one person, every 4 years, one person gets to win the 100 meters.
Yeah.
Out of approaching 7 billion on the planet, one person gets to do that. Those odds are pretty bad.
Yeah.
And, finding a way to make sports a more organic part of our life once you realize the reality that you're not going to do that potentially is, it's hard for people.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, last year, you mentioned David Epstein, and I've had him on here as well, and is the sports gene kind of shook up the world because he really touched on this taboo topic of genetics in sports. And we're learning so much now about the role of genetics. But I think your book sort of goes beyond that. You discuss that as a part, but there's a couple, you go into some whole other areas, and I just want to kind of throw out a couple of them at you, and maybe you can just give us the brief overview. One of them was, you call it the competitive benefits of being a late bloomer.
Right. Especially with the 10,000 hours stuff from Anders Ericsson as translated by Malcolm Gladwell, I've got friends who are holding their kids back from starting kindergarten, so they're relatively older. Which was another thing in Malcolm's book, was the relative age effect. That's not how most elite athletes develop.
Yeah.
It's not very hard to know who a great junior athlete is, because they're performing really well, and usually they're performing way better than their peers because they've matured faster. Right. Mature at different ages and times. So if you look at something like the Junior Track and Field World Championships, somewhere like 20-25% of those athletes go on to participate in the Olympics, which is an amazingly high percentage of any population to make it to the Olympic Games. I'm sort of more interested in the 75 or 80% who participate in the Olympics who weren't world class at the junior level. Mm-hmm. We tend to think that there's this pretty straight line, mm-hmm. and there's not. Being one big thing about being a late bloomer, I think, is it gives you a longer period of time to sample a lot of different sports. And not be sort of locked into a super hyper-competitive situation very early. The match between sport and athletes, not only physiologically and morphologically, like what type of body do you have, but just do you like it? Mm-hmm. If you don't like it, you have no hope of being great at it, because the things you have to do to be great, the sacrifices you have to make, are so profound. It's so I'm really... I hope if people take something away, and I'm sure you deal with this a lot, dealing with youth sports, is a long sampling period is very, very good.
Yeah.
And early specialization is not good.
Yeah.
It can work.
Mm-hmm.
That's not to say it's impossible, but it's not the most common path to elite success.
Yeah, and especially in this country, in the U.S. and I think Canada to an extent too, where it's a pay-to-play model.
Right.
When you are channeled into that early specialization, it costs a lot of money, and now all of a sudden price becomes barrier to entry. I have I'm from the soccer world, and yes, the big clubs have kids playing soccer year round when they're young, but they play a lot outside of practice, mm-hmm. and that's where they get most of their hours when they're really young, and B, the other piece of it is it doesn't cost them anything to be there. You're there on merit alone.
Right.
In our country, the better you are, the more it costs to keep playing.
Yeah, and those costs, not just financial costs, but sort of opportunity costs and other things. And just, it's I think it also fosters this idea that it's very transactionally based, right? Mm-hmm. And so parents are like, well, when I pay $10,000 a year, $20,000 a year, little Johnny's going to be great. It's like, well, little Johnny's not always going to be great.
Right.
And, and so...
Nor is he supposed to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So...
Yeah, I don't. Just recently, the U.S. Olympic Committee just released a bunch of statistics on this subject, and it was really interesting. 97% of the Olympians surveyed said that having a multi-sport background was a huge contributing factor to their success.
I mean, it's not even close, right? It's
yeah,
not
exactly.
Maybe. There's actually not much of a debate to have here, but there's sort of there's some science. Ericsson's work on expertise is really interesting, mm-hmm. but it's in different sorts of domains mm-hmm. very often, and we sort of take a little chunk of that and apply it super broadly, and, mm-hmm. and that's a problem.
Right, 10,000 hours was a convenient concept that was sticky and people could grab onto and say, and I've had many people, and I think these people who had mapped out 10,000 hours of practice for their kids, and like David Epstein said, and like you said, oh, but what about the guy who does 1,500 hours and he's an Olympian?
Yeah,
it's not just that.
it's not just that. It's, you know, if practice were all that were involved here, and like, why even run the event? Let's have a spreadsheet. Like everybody will submit their training program. We'll have people monitor your training program. If I train more than you, I win. Right? Yeah. It's not how it works.
Right. Exactly. And you know, the studies across many sports. There was a great study on tennis players. On, you know, they looked at the juniors. It was a Polish professor, and I forget his last name. And he looked at all the junior players, and then saw which ones made the top 100 as pros. And included Roger Federer and Kim Clijsters. You know, these were some of the top juniors, and what they found was that the ones who made it at pros were a little bit smaller, a little bit younger on average, practiced less, played less matches, but were very quick, and had parents who supported them in the right way.
And I mean, I think you hit on something interesting. I touch on it a little bit in my book. You know, the relative age effect. Gladwell talks about in hockey. There are more players in the NHL born earlier in the year than later in the year. The highest paid players in the NHL were born later in the year.
Yeah.
So it's probably a more difficult path to be relatively young through the junior programs. If you can survive that path, if you've constantly been pushed by more mature athletes, that's probably a good thing for your eventual athletic development. John Kessel, who I don't know if you know John.
I do, yeah.
Amazing coach and thinker about this. He talks about at USA Volleyball, they constantly see younger siblings. Like he feels like so many of his players are younger siblings who've been pushed by their older siblings or by their, you know, like playing backyard volleyball. You know, it's like you're a little pipsqueak and you have to be digging balls and figure some way out. You know, that sort of challenge, you know, it's a double-edged sword because it can be very discouraging. But if you can sort of overcome that potential discouragement, it seems like there's a possible advantage there.
Well, there's that development of, you know, let's call it the word we're using a lot now, grit, right? You develop grit by having to fight harder all along. And now when the physical things start to even out, you have that grit and you know how to work hard. And the other kid who it's always come easy for doesn't necessarily have that.
And it's, you know, some researchers in the UK use the phrase, to me, talent needs trauma. You know, we especially, I think, we talked about sort of cost and the transactional model. If you create a developmental pathway for an athlete that never challenges them, like really puts them into uncomfortable situations, like I think we have raised a lot of athletes who like get beat for the first time and are sort of like, whoa, like what just happened, right? You know, they don't have tools to deal with those obstacles. And so, when you talk about grit and that sort of growth mindset that Carol Dweck talks a lot about, I think those are important facets of it. Yeah,
and I actually heard John Kessel, he was interviewing Karch Kiraly the other day right after they won the World Championships, and one of the things, they brought the sports psychologist in with the team before the World Championships, and I think this is very applicable to all parents. They said, do you want to win every game for the rest of your life? Because we can arrange that, right? We can play bad opponents.
Yeah, we'll play terrible people.
And you win them all, but there's no excitement, there's no challenge, you're not going to get better. And when we take that down to the youth sports level, I say this to parents all the time, do you want your kids to win all their games for the rest of their life? Well, no. Okay, then why do we freak out every time we lose one?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. You know, it's that delta between process and outcome, right? And it's one of the things that's hardest in sports is you can have an incredible process. You can do everything right, and you get beat. You know, you can wake up with a stomach bug. You can crash your bike during a race. You can turn an ankle. The officials can blow a call. There's so many uncertainties. All you can do is control what you can control, do the best work you can do within those parameters, and trust like that good process will lead to good outcome most of the time.
Well, you know, another thing in your book that really stuck out to me, and it was great. I loved it because I'd read some of this research a while back, and I could never find it again. And it's the like importance of the mental game, especially when it comes to something like fatigue. I think this is absolutely fascinating. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, you know, so basically since the 20s, A.V. Hill was one of the founding fathers of what we now call exercise physiology. And he did these experiments running around a track in Manchester, and he had a big tank on his back and was breathing into a mask and capturing the gas that he was expelling. Hill's the one who came up with this idea of oxygen debt.
Right.
That you can run faster and faster, but at a certain point, you can't process any more oxygen, and things happen to the body. He also hypothesized that fatigue basically happens at the peripheral level, at the muscle itself. So I'm lifting or running or doing something, and eventually I fatigue the muscle. There's some mechanism there. We used to think it was lactic acid. It's not that. We used to think it was nutrients. Maybe that's some. But basically, the muscle finally says at one point, like, we're done. No more. So at the moment that happens, only about 40% of the muscle fibers fire in that muscle. Well, why is that? Like, so, that's really interesting. If you do other things, like if you tell me I'm going to run 10K, I'll start at a certain pace. And then if halfway through you're like, actually, we're going to run 20, I'll slow down. Even if I think to myself I won't slow down, but I'll also have run that 20K faster than I'll run 20K if you tell me I'm running 20K at the start. Tim Noakes, very famous exercise physiologist from South Africa, started gathering these threads and hypothesized what he calls the central governor. And the idea here is that it's the brain, it's the central system that basically controls everything that's happening in our body and about exercise. And the fatigue is really an emotion generated by the brain to help us regulate our output of energy with the goal of getting to the end of the event and being okay. That the body and the brain wants to protect itself. It's a really fascinating idea.
Yeah.
It's a really, really fascinating idea. Sam Marcora is another researcher who has a theory that is similar. It doesn't sort of have the trying to preserve the body part, but they both focus on sort of perception of effort. RPE is a phrase that we use a lot, and that's how hard do we think we're working, and we're terrible at it, right? Like we can be having a bad day where we think we're working super hard, and if you look, I keep talking about cycling, but on a bike, watts are watts. I know exactly how much work you're doing.
Yeah.
And some days that might feel like a 2, and some days that might feel like an 8.
Yeah.
And it's the same amount of physical work. What happens if you can start to hack those perceptions? So those deceptive studies sort of hack some of those perceptions. If you put somebody in a hot room, they'll run slower. If you tell them the room isn't that hot, they'll run faster again. I mean, our brains, our capacity for having our brains sort of manipulated, pretty high. We're smart and really dumb in other ways, right? Like behavioral economics, there's all this crazy stuff that shows that. So
yeah,
this is a hugely long answer to the question, but what's really exciting, I think, is that possibility of what is that other 60%, and what can you do to try and look at that interface between the brain and physical performance and unlock some of that 60%.
Right, and this is not, and the fine line we walk is this is not carte blanche for the coach whose kid is puking in the 105-degree heat to say you're not really tired, it's just in your head. No, that kid has heat exhaustion.
Yeah.
But it's also to say, it's often our brain that shuts off before our muscles no longer have the capability to keep performing.
I think that's totally true. I mean, and it maps with my experience, again, as a bike racer. Noakes has this phrase that he uses. He says, the winner of the race is the person for whom losing is the least acceptable.
I love that. Yeah, I love that one.
And he talks about that moment that, in that framework, like you decide at a certain point to lose.
Yeah.
And once you do it, you feel better.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I'm okay with this. Yeah.
And I feel like I've had that experience on the bike. I've done some cyclocross racing. It's super high intensity. It's an hour-long effort, and you're way over threshold most of the time. And, you have that moment where that guy's just sort of dangling in front of you. It's like, I can't get to that wheel. I can't get to that wheel. It's like, okay, I guess I'm not going to get to that wheel. And, it's just like,
Yeah.
And it's done. You just decided to lose.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I talk about this as well, is when something you said before, when you bring enjoyment into an activity, you're also more likely to push harder at it too. I talk about it all the time. I'm a big skier. I live in Bend, Oregon. I get to ski all the time. I'll go, and I'm a telemark skier, so I'll go out and do 5 straight hours of lunges in knee-deep powder, and I'm laughing and smiling the whole time, even though my legs are on fire. Let's do it again. If I was running, I'm done after 25 minutes. I'm bored. I'm done. I'm sore.
If you were doing it in the gym, if I told you like, okay, just go to the gym and do physically the same thing, like you'd just be like, no.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's amazing. One other thing that I thought was really fascinating, some of the research you brought up, that maybe one of the biggest performance enhancement tools that everyone has is sleep.
We have such a messed up attitude about sleep in this country.
Yeah.
I mean, and I do think that there's something cultural about it. And, I'm in the Bay Area, right? And there's all these so Silicon Valley guys who are like, I only sleep 4 hours a night.
It's a badge of honor.
That's cool. Yeah, it is a badge of honor.
Yeah.
So Sherry Ma works down at Stanford at their sleep center, which is one of the preeminent sleep research facilities in the country. She looked around to the athletics programs there and said, like, hey, who wants to be my guinea pig? And actually the basketball team did, the men's basketball team. So she put wristbands on all of them to see how much they were sleeping at night, and also asked them to report how much they were sleeping at night. So they all said, oh, I'm totally sleeping 8 hours, and they were really sleeping about 6 2/3. And they did baseline measurements. They did shuttle runs and shot free throws and 3-pointers. Sort of had a baseline, and then she said to all of them, like, I want you to sleep as much as you can. Like, I want you to extend your sleep as much as you can figure out a way to do. Like, no minimum, just like more. So they went from 6 1/3 to almost 8 1/2. 6 2/3 to 8 1/2, about 100 minutes more on average. Every member of the team ran faster when they did shuttle runs again. Every member of the team made more 3-pointers. Every member of the team shot free throws better.
Yeah.
We view sleep as this necessary evil, as a waste of time. And it's not. It's a performance enhancer.
Yeah.
It just is.
Yeah, and that's fascinating. And this is something that every athlete, or if you're a parent of a young athlete, that's something that you do have great control over.
In theory, I mean, I think that, I have kids who are 9 and 7, and I already see overscheduling. I already see too many things to do. It's like I get home at the end of the day, and it's eat dinner, work on homework, practice piano, do this, do that, and like try and get, it's just like there's no time.
Yeah.
And, so I'm trying, personally as a parent, trying to find ways to push back on that a little bit and be like, look, like, let's find time to like sit and have a conversation. Let's try and find time to like go to bed at a reasonable hour and like sleep reasonably, because we're better at stuff when we do that.
Yeah, and I'm in the same boat as you, and having a long background in sports as an athlete, and then as a coach, and now my kids are the same age as yours, and I feel the same pressures of like, well, you got to sign them up for this, and you got to get them doing that, and you got to, and then I do all the research and I do all the stuff, and I'm right on the forefront of this, and it's very hard for me, even knowing all that, to say, no, you know what I have to do is tell my kid, go outside and play in the yard, and just do your own thing for a while.
It's so funny. It's another way we deceive ourselves, right? It's like, that gap between knowledge and practice can be pretty hard. Yeah,
it is, and I fight it as well. My daughter just had a birthday, and bunch of her friends came over here, and with my wife, of just saying, we don't have to organize anything. They're 9. They'll figure it out. And they had plenty of fun, and they're like, oh, we got to go already. And that's the thing. It's like we've so overscheduled and overorganized our kids' lives that we really take away a great deal when we don't let them play and we don't let them figure it out for themselves. When everything's about rules and structure that fits adult needs, our kids really suffer.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you talk about there as well, and again, when I talked to David Epstein, he talked about, from a genetic standpoint, how different athletes have different sensitivities to training. You even talk about how different athletes have different sensitivities to performance-enhancing drugs as a reason to not allow performance-enhancing drugs, because even if everyone did them, some people would still have an unfair advantage. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments, so when you talk about PEDs, like one argument you can make, and I've made it myself in the past, is like, just let anybody do anything.
Right.
Like, why are we trying to deal with this? Dan Dan Coyle and Tyler Hamilton in Tyler's expose of sort of what he did, talk about, people will say then, okay, then it's a level playing field because everybody can do that. It's not some people who are doing PEDs and some who aren't, except it's not a level playing field because our bodies, we're such individuals. We're like, and that sounds trite, but our responses to everything are so individualized. You and I could do the same workout, eat the same meal, sleep the same amount, and have totally different outcomes. We're different.
Yeah.
Some people respond differently to anabolic agents than others. Some people respond differently to EPO than others. Some people start, so in cycling, like the rule was you could have a hematocrit of 50, sort of like what percentage of red blood cells were in your blood. Maybe I start from 42, and so I get 8 more by doping. Maybe you start from 48 and you only get 2 more. Like I get much more out of doping than you because of where the limits are set. So, it just shifts the unlevel playing field.
Yeah.
The playing field's never level.
Yeah.
It's not. People are born with exceptional physiologies. People are born with exceptional trainability. People are born with profound disadvantages. The playing field's not level. And again, if it were, I think it's always interesting to sort of argue the most absurdist position. So in the same way of arguing like, oh, let's all show up with a spreadsheet and that's the competition. Like if the playing field were level, completely level, every race would be a tie. That's point 2, right? So, I think to me where I finally, I'd written about doping in Wired magazine in the past and have thought more than I would like to about it, frankly. Where I sort of end up is that anti-doping isn't about catching the crooks. It's about trying to preserve as best you can the ability of a clean athlete to be competitive. And that's, like in the same way that like just because people get away with doping doesn't mean we should allow it. We don't allow, this is hyperbolic, we don't allow murder because sometimes people get away with murder, right? Like we've decided, we're going to do our best to try.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. So last little bit, what about from a coaching standpoint? We have a lot of coaches on here, and one of the things that I teach a lot is that the science of coaching is is a couple decades ahead of the practice of coaching these days. What we now know about how people learn and how skill is best and fastest acquired is usually not the way people coach.
Not at all. And there's a section on skill acquisition in the book, and your readers and listeners probably know this, but that partial practice is not great. That blocked practice is not great. That you want whole and random practice. That the more you can simulate the competitive environment, the better. Practice should be hard and messy. This is another thing John Kessel talks about is like, people always want practice to look good. Practice shouldn't look good. Practice should look terrible sometimes, right? If you're really pushing athletes to do new things, it shouldn't look good. Your AD should walk into the gym and be like, oh my God, what's happening? He shouldn't walk into the gym and be like, look at my well-oiled machine that's going to show up because that's not going to lead to progression. One of the amazing things about sports is we practice. I don't practice doing my job. I just do my job. So it's an immense opportunity to push yourselves in a place where that's safe and okay. But the trick is to make that place safe and okay, and that's hard. It's really hard.
And I forget in your book if you talked. There's a guy named Mark Upton who's the head of the English Institute of Sports. He's their new coaching science director, and him and I have talked about this exact thing. Where a lot of times we want 90% success as coaches in practice because it serves our ego. Right? Oh, look how good we look in practice. But then the game comes, and what is the number one comment I hear from coaches on the sideline? But we went over this in practice. Well, sure. I mean, you learned it.
Yeah. I mean, you did it, but, it's like, some of those really early skill acquisition studies just on sort of blocked versus random. It's much easier to pick up a skill blocked. If I just like hit my pitching wedge 10,000 times in a row, I'll start to hit my pitching wedge pretty well. the retention is very poor
Right.
for blocked practice, right? So like, so you get these sort of illusory benefits early on, especially I think with younger athletes as you're trying to teach them new skills. You sort of feel like, oh, well, they've totally got it. Well, no, they've got it in the context of a volleyball coach tossing 100 perfect balls to a setter, or a coach tossing a three-point shooter 100 perfect passes. Like, you're never going to get a pass like that in a game.
Yeah.
You're going to be on the move. Your heart rate's going to be elevated. Like, there's a defender there. Like, none of the things are the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to expect the exact same outcome is, you know, it's a little naive.
Yeah, and I always use the example when coaches say, "Oh no, but this is how we have to do it this way." I say, well, then when we're teaching our kid to ride a bike, why don't we put them on a stationary bike, right?
Just you put them on a stationary. Kessel loves talking about that, right? Like, did your parents hire a bike coach?
Bike coach,
like,
no.
Did you do single leg repeats, like 10 pedal strokes with the right leg and then 10 with the left leg, and then try and put them together? It's like, no, you got on a bike and you did it.
And you did. You crashed and you burned and you skinned your elbow and you, yeah, and that's the amazing part, right? It's like context is the word.
Context is the word, but then, like, just to torture this metaphor super slightly, like, then we use that skill as an example of something you can't ever forget, right? Like, it's so ingrained, and it's like, oh, it's just like riding a bike. Like, I just, once you learn it, you know, it doesn't disappear, it doesn't decay or go away. And I think part of that really is because it's one of the few things that we just, like, toss people, you know, it's like, people used to toss people in the water and be like, figure out how to swim, dude. Like, good luck. But, you know, it's one of the few places we do that physically with our kids.
Yeah. And I just taught my kids how to snowboard. And the first day, my son's like, he could make a turn on one side. And he's like, I'm going over that jump. I'm like, you don't even know how to turn. But he was ready to move to the next step.
Yeah, let's go. And
let's go.
He probably bit it pretty hard, right?
Very hard. But he didn't deter him from doing it again.
Yeah, because it's his idea, right? If you made him go over the jump, that's a whole different problem.
Exactly, that wouldn't have worked at all. Yeah, well, this has been awesome, Mark. Any parting words, thoughts for a parent or coach who's got a kid in youth sports? Again, I advise them all to get this book because it's fascinating, because you just learn so much about sports and about science, and it really dispels some of these myths. But if my kids are 12 years old and they're playing a sport, what are you going to apply with your own kids growing up here?
I mean, the real talk is, like, please stop making plans that your kid's going to be an Olympian. Like, if that happens, that's awesome. But statistically, it's almost impossible. I mean, I think the most important thing about sports for kids is creating, it's the same thing with kids and reading. Like, I want my kid to love reading and love that activity the rest of their life. I want my girls to love sports. I want them to love being active and healthy and fit. And I want them to learn some of the things that I think sports teach you around competition and teamwork. But that enjoyment to me is really, I think, the key thing that, that's the relationship that 99.99999% of humanity gets to have with sports, is hopefully a lifelong enjoyment of physical activity and fandom. And so, like, please don't lose sight of that in pursuit of, that 1/1,000,000th of a percent possibility that they'll stand on the Olympic podium.
Huge. Great advice. Great parting thought. Where can people find your book? Where can people find more of your work?
Yeah, so my website is McClusky.com. That's MCCLUSKY.com. Links to purchase the book there. It's Amazon, Barnes & Noble, all the places you can buy books these days. It should be there.
Awesome. Well, hey, thank you so much for your time today, and best of luck. And we're going to do our part to spread the word about this great book, Faster, Higher, Stronger. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you, John.